So this talk today is entitled The 1641 Massacre and the Origins of Sectarianism. We'll start with a wee story. I was on the Curriculum Examination and Assessments Board for Northern Ireland, and I was on the panel that was responsible for GCSE history. And most of the people on the panel, as you might suspect, were from the Roman Catholic school sector. And one day up there in the offices, they're down by the harbour there, we had this source, this history source to discuss. And the question was whether it would be put into the examination paper for 16-year-olds sitting at GCSE history or not. And the topic that we were considering was the plantation. So here we are, we have a source for the plantation. And I'm going to try and read it to you now. Listen to this. From Scotland came many, and from England not a few, yet generally the scum of both nations, who for want of debt or breaking and fleeing from justice or seeking shelter came hither. Most of the people made up a body, and it's strange, of different names, nations, dialects, tempers, breeding, and in a word, all void of godliness, who seemed rather to flee from God in this enterprise than follow their own mercy. What an amazing description of the people that came here during the plantation. And this description of them, the scum of the earth, lacking in godliness, fleeing from debt. This quotation was used by James Connolly, the founder of the Citizen Army, the first Red Army in Europe. The thing about my problem was that I knew this source that they were putting down that would be put into the examination paper for 16-year-olds. And the thing that I knew about the source was that it was incomplete. They had missed out part of the story. And the part of the story had been presented by a Reverend Andrew Stewart of Donaghadee in his History of the Church of Ireland. And this is what he finished that paragraph with. I have seen them myself, stricken and swoon with the word, yea, a dozen in one day, carried out of doors as dead. So marvellous was the power of God smiting them in their hearts for sin. So these wretched, godless people fleeing from debt and crime, they experienced a God-given and a heaven-sent revival, which changed their character. But as far as the Roman Catholic teachers were concerned, and presumably James Connolly in his day, when I drew this portion of the quote to their attention, they dropped the source. It didn't go into the exam paper. They didn't want to alert the young people sitting the exam of the impact of a spirit-filled revival on the people of Ulster. The next thing that I want to talk to you about is a discovery that I made that was unsettling. And this was found in this, this is really, really battered, but it's a wonderful book. It's called Ulster Castles and Defensive Buildings. It was produced by the BBC when they had money to produce historical material for young people. And I had this booklet before me, and I was going through it, and I made this discovery. In 1641, which we're going to be talking about, during the Rising, there was apparently a massacre of people whose bodies were concealed in large souterrains, that's underground passages, of which there were large numbers in Ireland in the past. Their bodies were concealed in large underground passages or souterrains in County Antrim, 220 in one of the caves, as they call them, and 63 in another. So here's a total of 283 people whose remains were buried in these caves. That's the equivalent of a jumbo jet 747 crashing somewhere in North Antrim to lose that number of people. I tried to research this. I was puzzled by this. How come there's somewhere in Antrim where there's 283 people buried and nobody knows anything about it? So I wrote to the head of the Museums and Old Buildings Department in Northern Ireland, a man called McHugh, and he tried to be helpful, but he had no clue as to where these people had been buried. Now, my point is that if these had been Roman Catholic people who had been buried, we would have heard all about it. There would have been an annual pilgrimage to the site, and they would want somebody to blame for what had happened. So I suspect that these 283 anonymous people buried in North Antrim as a result of the 1641 rebellion were probably Protestants. And yet no proper record was kept of these people or what happened to them. There they were, buried somewhere up there near Portrush, and nobody knows anything about them. Now there's a relationship between the source that I quoted to you at the beginning of this little conversation and the 283 people who are missing. And that relationship has to do with the kind of people, Protestants, Unionists, Loyalists, all that clump of people are like. We're hopeless at telling our own story. We're hopeless at telling our own story. Now, I want to come and talk to you about an event called the 1641 Massacre. And as I was being brought over here by the famous Jack Lamb and Evan, both of them said with one accord, like a chorus in an opera, "We know nothing about the 1641 Massacre." If you're involved in the Orange, at some time you will have encountered either on television or through some other means Portadown Orange District. And if you've ever encountered Portadown Orange District, they have a banner showing all these naked people being pushed towards a bridge because they're the victims of the 1641 rebellion, and they're about to be pushed into the River Bann, and an end made of them. But there was much more to the 1641 rebellion than the murder of Protestants in Portadown. There's not a banner in the whole of Belfast County that refers to these events, because these events didn't impinge on Belfast, but they were out there in the rest of Ulster. And the first man that we need to come across is a man called Sir Phelim O'Neill. Sir Phelim O'Neill, and you might say, in some respects, he's the father of sectarianism. Because one thing that Sir Phelim O'Neill wanted more than anything else was Protestants out of Ireland. Protestants out of Ireland. That was his clarion call. That was his mission. And he had the power to do something about it because he was a very powerful man. But he wasn't alone. Over there in Spain and Europe, in the monasteries of Spain and Europe, Roman Catholic priests, monks and the like, were plotting a rebellion in Ireland. It was to be secret. Nobody was to know anything about it. They were to fall upon the Protestants in surprise. And that's how they would take the country back and get rid of the Protestants. And so this dreadful scheme was fomented and worked up and planned. In the meantime, we didn't live in a United Kingdom. There was England, there was Scotland, they were all under King Charles I, and there was Ireland, and it was also under Charles I. But these different nations, England, Scotland, and Ireland, did not agree and were not united, because the unification of Britain doesn't come until 1707 and then 1801. So the country was a hodgepodge. And a war was raging between Charles I and the Cavaliers, and Oliver Cromwell and Fairfax, and the Cromwellians in Parliament. And so the conspirators thought, we can organize ourselves in such a way as to claim that Charles I is supporting the actions we are taking against the Protestants in Northern Ireland, because they are from Scotland, they're Covenanters, and they're not supporting Cromwell in Parliament. And so they began to foment this rebellion. And they achieved great secrecy, and they achieved a great surprise. The only problem was, there was a man called Owen Connolly, or Owen O'Connor, I forget whether it's O'Connor or Connolly, and he was an orphan child. And this Protestant family took Owen O'Connor in and brought him up as one of their own. And he became a Protestant and accepted the Reformed faith. But as far as his neighbours and people in the outlying districts were concerned, they assumed he was a Catholic Irishman like themselves. So while all this plan was going on in the utmost secrecy, somebody whispered in Owen's ear that there was going to be a rebellion, there was going to be a surprise attack, and people were going to be driven out of the country. So Owen went and informed the authorities in Dublin of what was afoot. This meant that when the rebellion broke out, Dublin was safe and secure, because they had had a warning. Then there was another man in the Fermanagh part of the world down near Enniskillen called Sir William Cole, a great estate owner, but he kept a weather eye open, and he noticed that there had been strange goings on at Phelim O'Neill's house in Tyrone. He had notes of the fact that people were seen coming and going, and coming and going, and so he worked out that something was afoot, and so he prepared his local people to be on their guard. This meant that when Phelim O'Neill launched his attack, seized Charlemont, seized Moneymore and all these other places, Sir William Cole and his area was defended. And it wasn't just him. Londonderry also held out, as did Coleraine and other places. So although the rebellion took place, they were not completely successful. Parts of Ulster held out. Parts of Ulster were able to cry out for help. And they turned to Scotland for help. And the Scots resolved to send them an army under a famous general. He had written books about military warfare. His name was Monroe. They were going to send them an army under General Monroe. He arrived at Carrickfergus with 2,500 men, and he quickly rallied others to join him. In the meantime, two important individuals arrived in Ireland, whose names are worth recording in the history books. One of them was called Owen Roe O'Neill, a relation of Phelim O'Neill, but of a very different stamp or character. He was a military man of great skill and has learnt military warfare on the continent of Europe. So he arrives in Ireland, a man trained in warfare, who knew what he was about. And another man arrives in Ireland who sounds like a modern ice cream parlour. His name was Rinuccini. And he was the papal nuncio. And he was there for the most powerful Roman Catholic in Ireland. And his one aim was to advance the power of the papacy in Europe, including Ireland. That was his one aim. If we look at the situation, we suddenly discover that there's a split between Sir Phelim O'Neill and Owen Roe O'Neill and Rinuccini. And this split becomes very, very important. Phelim O'Neill is only interested in his land and his Gaelic-speaking Catholic retainers. Owen Roe O'Neill defers or accepts orders from Rinuccini, the parliamentary or the papal nuncio. This becomes very important. General Monroe wants to bring Owen Roe O'Neill to battle. General Monroe is overconfident. General Monroe is impatient. And so on a fateful day, they meet at the place called Benburb. And Owen Roe O'Neill has his army of pikemen, and General Monroe has a mixture of Scots Covenanters, local people from Ulster, and British people from Ulster. And they go to battle. And Monroe is heavily defeated. The pikemen push Monroe's soldiers into the river at Benburb. So they have the choice of standing there and have a pike driven through them or drowning in the river. Some manage to make their escape, as does General Monroe. But for that instant, and for a little while after, Ulster is at the mercy of Owen Roe O'Neill and his army. What's going to happen? Well, Owen Roe O'Neill realizes that to conquer the whole of Ulster will involve a campaign in which he will meet fierce resistance from the plantation Scots and British who remain. That old adage from Londonderry years later still holds true, or held true in the past. No surrender. He knew he would face a tremendous difficulty taking Ulster, so he delayed, and he delayed. Meantime, there was more political intrigue going on in the south of Ireland in a place called Kilkenny. It was known as the Confederation of Kilkenny. And the papal nuncio, Rinuccini, was not pleased at the way things were going. So he needed Owen Roe O'Neill to march his army out of Ulster and down to Kilkenny to settle the fist fight that he was having with the people in the south of Ireland. And that's exactly what happened. The papal nuncio Rinuccini ordered Owen Roe O'Neill to march his forces down to Kilkenny to settle an argument that Rinuccini was having with the locals. And so, when the army moved out, the people in Ulster were able to regroup, reorganise, and prepare to defend themselves. In a sense, when Owen Roe O'Neill's army marches out of Ulster, Ulster breathes a sigh of relief and lives to fight another day. And that fight comes later in 1688, 1690, when Enniskillen and Londonderry hold out for King William and the glorious revolution. That's getting ahead of the story. So we now have a situation where the people of Ulster are able to regroup, where people who fled from Ulster and went to Scotland for refuge are coming back, and Monroe and his army are beginning to get themselves organised. And so Phelim O'Neill's plan to drive the Protestants out of Ulster collapses. It fails. And so Ulster breathes again another day. And what I would like to do now is to bring you a couple of quotations which I think are very, very important and help us understand the situation and help us understand the situation that we're in at the moment. Because in those days, the Protestant community were all divided up into bits and pieces and bits and pieces. There was a British army here of a few people. There was a Lagan army over there in Donegal of a few people. And there was a little army gathered around Carrickfergus. They're all in bits and pieces. There was no agreement amongst them. There was no unity amongst them. And I'm sure you're thinking to yourself, well, that sounds a little bit familiar. That sounds a little bit like the situation that I know. Nevertheless, the outcome is very significant. Let's see if we can find it. Here we are. This is a great book. Scottish Covenanters and Irish Confederates. It's a history of the days I've been talking about. There's a wee picture of Sir Phelim O'Neill. Both Presbyterianism in Ulster and the position of Scots as the dominant element in the Ulster plantation thus survived Cromwellian rule. Charles I and Strafford, the Confederate Irish and the Commonwealth and Protectorate regimes had all tried to get rid of them, but all had failed. So they had numerous enemies in the 1640 to 1646 period, yet they survived and they came through. Not unscathed, but they survived and they came through. And then there's another quotation I want to bring to you, if I can find it in all of my hodgepodge of notes. It's from this book here. This is a most marvellous book. I don't know what I'd do without it. It's called The Irish Border as a Cultural Divide. And it was written by a Dutch professor called Hesslinger. And it's one of the best histories you can get on our story here in this island. Now, just be patient with me, and we'll see if we can find this quotation. We're not getting there, but basically what Hesslinger says is that the immigration into Ulster of the Presbyterians was an immigration by a whole society, from working class people right up to lords and ladies. It was a whole society that moved into Northern Ireland, and that's why we're in the situation we're in today. Now, Phelim O'Neill wanted to get rid of the Protestants, but the story of the 1641s is that despite all the enemies that Ulster faced, Ulster came through. Ulster was able to breathe again, reorganise, and face the next trial or temptation or challenge that was going to emerge. So I hope I've kept my 30 minutes. I've done my best.